My name is David Hart. I'm the director of the Mitchell Center. It's great to have you here beginning the new semester. A wonderful talk we have underway. Some of the stuff that's going by, next week's talk by Yellow Green. Going to be a great lineup this year, or this semester, so I hope you'll return. Not really great mix. Today I'm delighted to introduce an extraordinary environmental journalist, Murray Carpenter. We have a common friend, and so I had the pleasure of meeting Murray a long time ago after coming to Maine. He didn't grow up in Maine, but boy does he present as a Mainer, as near as I can judge. His bio's pretty impressive, but even the way his freelance work, when it says in the same line that he's freelancer for the New York Times and the Bangor Daily News, I like to see those two great papers side by side, as well as NPR. In fact, by my count, he's had six stories in the New York Times in the last 18 months. My brother was a journalist for about 40 years, so I kind of, and my older brother, so I have to look up to him. Not literally, but figuratively. And so I look up to pretty much all journalists. Just a few months ago, in October, I think, he had a wonderful story in the Times about work where Gail and Joe and others are involved, Gail and Joe Zaleski and their colleagues, about all linked to remember we're on an island in the middle of the Penobscot, so fish are swimming by, and his story is about this amazing thing that's been going on. His first story on that topic, I think, was in '97. So the 20 years or so unfolding of what's become one of the most ambitious river restoration projects in the world. His most recent story was in the Times, and it's a really fascinating story. And it's wonderful because it kind of helps remind the people, there's a pretty big grant, actually, I think it's the biggest that's ever been given out in the U.S. to study this, that we call the Future of Dams Project. It involves 6 institutions. We're one of the leads on that, and lots of good faculty and students involved. So it was really exciting to see that story. He's also written a book, Caffeinated, How Our Daily Habit Helps, Hurts, and Hooks Us. So he's got broad interests and a really engaging writing style. I think today, if we're lucky, he'll help us think about what makes a good news story, when's the best time to tell it, how should it be reported. Of course, he'll be telling it from the standpoint of a journalist, but I wouldn't be surprised if there's folks in the audience who think you have some stories that would be worth telling, and you might get your own ideas about this, and in any case, you'll know how to track somebody down who's often looking for good stories. And I think an interesting, David Sims, our own science writer, where are you, David? Oh, back there, wrote a great thing on the web that you can go read about Murray's talk and Murray, and one of the things in there is kind of that this food web that's in his title, or food chain, that there's both great stories that don't get picked up, and there's stories that get picked up that maybe aren't so great. And so how does that happen? In case you think I'm kind of impartial about great stories, I got in line first and pitched him a story about 10 minutes ago that, trust me, it's a winner. It's the Matagamon Dam story, like 2 weeks ago. So his talk today is entitled From Frog Fungus to Smashed Dams, great Maine Science Journalism and the Messed Up Food Chain of News. Murray, welcome. Thank you.
Thanks. This is quite a crowd. I really wasn't expecting it. So
I'm glad you all.
all right. So thanks everyone for coming out. Can you hear me? Okay. Good. It's an honor to be here. I plan to talk for maybe 25 minutes or a little more, and I'd really like to have a good amount of time for a discussion. I think you'll all have questions, or I hope some of you will have questions. And, it's a small enough group that if you have questions, if something's unclear or demonstrably false as I'm talking, just jump right in, okay, please. As I was thinking about this talk, I started going back through the many University of Maine stories I've reported over the years, and a lot of them have been environmental or science stories, and I'm sure I missed some, but these are just some of the people that I remember talking to. Joyce Longcore, who's here, the expert on the chytrid fungus, which we'll talk more about in a minute. Steve Call, the former director of the Mitchell Center, I think the founding director of the Mitchell Center. I talked to him about I talked to him about clearcutting years ago. Aram Calhoun, I've talked to about wetlands and amphibians. Cindy Lofton about fishless lakes. George Jacobson and Kirk Mosh about climate change. Stephen Norton on road salt, that was a long time ago. Sarah Lindsay on marine worms. Habib Dagger on composites, he's the guy who does all the composite works, the bridge and the backpack. They happen to build one right down the street from my house. William Crone about lynx. Michael Kinnison about contemporary evolution. Kinnison and Gail Zaleski, who's here, and Joe Zaleski, among others, have been key sources on Penobscot River stories, which I'll also talk more about later on. So these are just direct sources. I mean, my brother got a master's degree here studying with Ivan Fernandez years ago, and so that's another University of Maine connection. I've just been influenced in my reporting by a lot of people from the University of Maine. So it's kind of been fun to go back and look at some of these stories for this talk. Some of these stories have wound up at in the Republican Journal, where I used to work in Belfast. It's a weekly. At Maine Times. Does anyone remember Maine Times? Okay, it was a tabloid weekly that covered the state. It would be known as an alternative weekly these days. And I worked there in the late '90s. It was a really, really fun job. I've reported for Audubon Magazine, Down East Magazine, the Boston Globe, Maine Public Radio, National Public Radio, and the New York Times, as David Hart mentioned. And there's just a long-winded way of saying there's so many stories to tell right here on this campus. I mean, it's really a treasure trove. And those are just the science stories. As a general assignment reporter, I've been here to do other stories, business stories, etc. Over the years. And I'd probably, if I had been working all these years as a daily reporter, I'd probably have reported far more stories from this campus. When I come up here to do a story, like if I walk down the halls in Deering or Nutting Hall, I get distracted by all the posters and everything that's on the wall, and I want to write down story ideas as I'm going. So there's just a lot of stories to be told up here. So that brings us to the theme of the talk. What makes a good science story for a general audience? And what makes a good science story for a national audience? And what's the best way to tell it? And when is the best time to tell it? Unfortunately, this is a really imprecise science, and it can even sometimes seem a little bit random. And it's the job not just of a reporter, but also of an editor to figure out when the best time is to do this. So I'm going to try to illustrate this with a couple of stories, one about the Frog Fungus and the other about the Penobscot River. And as we go along, I'd like to underscore a few of the elements that can make a good news story, and this could be a science story or otherwise, that can make it engaging to the reader. And one thing, obviously, is timeliness. Breaking news, there's a reason that we all pay attention to breaking news. When something is just about to happen, or it just happened yesterday, or it's going to happen tomorrow, it's got a news hook, it's automatically compelling just because it's going on right now. So that's always an important aspect of a story, or it's usually an important aspect of a story. Superlatives, okay? The biggest, the best, the most, the newest. These often make great stories, and there's a challenge here, which we can talk about later, which is you don't want to overhype a story as a journalist or as an editor. And this is a constant push and pull. And so, but superlatives are really, really an important aspect of a good story. A mystery always makes a great story, and particularly science stories are often really good mysteries. A scientist is going out to figure out, are there fish in the river? What's killing these frogs? A mystery is really a lot of great science stories are mysteries. A lot of great news stories are mysteries. And there's a less tangible notion that I think a good story will have the ability to sort of shift your focus, to look at something that's an everyday item that might be mundane or common, and to sort of flip it, and suddenly you're seeing it in a different light, or with more depth, and it maybe becomes more interesting to you. So I think that's another element that good news stories have, and good science news stories. So I want to start off with the chytrid fungus. So is everyone here aware of the chytrid fungus? Okay. It's also known as the frog fungus, and it's a fungus that has been infecting frogs in North America for decades now, and it spread into. I'm really worried because we have the world's expert on chytrid fungus in the audience, so I don't want to make any mistakes here. But it spread to Central America and started killing frogs in a pretty dramatic way. And there were populations that were extirpated rather quickly, some that may have gone extinct. And this was starting to come to the public's attention in 1999. In the spring of 1999, I read a news article in the journal Science, and it was about this amphibian declines and this fungus that people were starting at that point to think, okay, this is what's killing frogs. This is what's responsible for these massive die-offs. And on the third page of the article, it mentioned, chytrid specialist Joyce Longcore, University of Maine, Orono. And I was like, whoa, right here, we have a specialist. So I underlined that, went back to work at Maine Times, pulled the page out and stuck it in my story folder. And then, a few weeks later, I called up Joyce, came up here and started talking to her. And so this is an interesting story. Joyce is a mycologist, and she named this fungus. She identified and named this fungus that was indeed killing frogs dramatically. Likely originated in Africa, may have arrived here on African clawed frogs that were used for pregnancy tests. But one of the thing that really stuck with me about the story was not just that she had the world's largest collection of this fungus in a freezer in Deering Hall, which was cool enough. But the thing that really interested me was that when she was starting to look at this, she asked her husband, who was going out on a frog route, who was the USGS biologist, said, "Hey, can you grab me a couple of frogs?" So he came home with some road-killed frogs. It was spring, the frogs. And got the first frog she looked at, a leopard frog, had the chytrid fungus. So this wasn't just something that was going on in the tropics. The fungus was here at sublethal levels. And that was something that I think everyone was talking about this in the context of what's going on in Costa Rica, what's happening to all these frogs. No one knew it's here. No one knew it's right here in Maine in all the frogs that you're looking at all the time, or many of them. And so I was really intrigued by that. I was like, wow, okay, cool. So, but, I went back to Maine Times and did this little inside story. But, I never forgot about that. I was really interested in, this fungus was here. And so, was like 7 years later, the story became much bigger. More frogs were dying off. It had really entered the national conversation, and there was this discussion now which was and probably remains controversial that the extinction that the chytrid was working hand in hand with climate change to force these extirpations and even extinctions. But so the nation was talking about this, at least the environmental community. But still no one was talking about the fact that, these frogs hopping through our backyards, a lot of them have the chytrid. So I talked to an editor at the New York Times about it, and he was really intrigued. And so I went back and talked to Joyce and looked at her samples again, and then ended up doing a story for the New York Times. And so that was 7 years later. And the only reason I mention this story is because I think it's emblematic of how stories are. They can take a long and circuitous path to becoming a national story. For me, once I find a story I like, I stick with it, and I don't want to let it go. And it's often hard to know when it's going to be ready for a bigger national treatment. But this one clearly was, and this was a while ago. Now this is 2006. And people are still doing stories about this. There was a really good one in Nautilus magazine about the fungus and about Joyce's research just maybe 2 months ago. So anyway, that's like the long 7-year road from a local or statewide story to a national story. What made it a good national story in 2006? Well, the publicity had made Americans ready for this. They were familiar with the fungus. They were ready for a national story. It was not abstract to them. It had a mystery. What's killing the frogs? Where did it come from? The story certainly had superlatives. Most lethal fungus, largest collection of the fungus, first person to describe the fungus. Again, editors love superlatives, readers love superlatives. You don't want to force superlatives onto a story where they don't deserve to be, but this one had them. And again, it had this less tangible sense that it makes you see something common, like Maine's amphibians in a whole new light. You see a wood frog. Well, you think, maybe he's got chytrid. Maybe he's got a fungus that came from Africa on pregnancy tests. It's different, right? It's suddenly a different frog. To me, it is anyway. And it has a secondary theme that Joyce mentioned when we talked in very concisely phrased as the globalization of the biota. And this is the idea that organisms are traveling around the world very quickly now. And, we often call them invasive species when they're doing harm. But this has been a very rich vein to mine for me over the years. I've done stories, about Asian longhorn beetles, butternut canker, invasive fish, et cetera, et cetera. So that was also a secondary theme of that story. So anyway, that's why I kind of wanted to talk about the chytrid story, because I think it's kind of an interesting story, and I think it represents a lot of what can be fun and exciting about science reporting. Now, the other story I want to mention is one I've covered fairly consistently for 20 years, and that's migratory fish in Maine and the dams that affect them, especially on the Penobscot. This is the old VZ Dam. And let's see, I guess I got a pointer here. What do I do to make this point?
The top button, sort of the top part of the
Oh, there we go. Okay, so over here on the side, this is a really antiquated fish ladder that was in use probably in the middle part of the last century. Is that right, Catherine? 1930s. Okay, thank you. Out in the center here, that sticking out there, that is a weird, right in the middle of the dam is where the fish ladder was for Atlantic salmon. This is the VZ Dam. It was just above Bangor. It was the first impediment on the Penobscot as fish were migrating upward from the sea. Let's see, the other dam, this is the old Great Works Dam, which was just a couple miles from here in Old Town, and would have been the next obstacle upstream of the VZ Dam. Now, these dams, of course, blocked migratory fish pretty effectively. There was a fish ladder on both, and neither were great. I think there was a fish ladder. Was there a fish ladder on this one, Catherine, as well? Or did people trap and truck? Okay. Anyway, there was certainly one on VZ. But these dams were at the center of conflicts over the river and its fish for decades. While I was looking back at clips for this talk, I realized I've been covering issues on the Penobscot long enough to have been at press events on the banks of the river with 3 secretaries of the Interior, Ken Salazar, Gail Norton, and even Bruce Babbitt. And Bruce Babbitt was here on a sunny summer day in 1999, July 1st, 1999. And the reason he was here in Maine is because there was a major national news story that day, which was Edwards Dam on the Kennebec was coming out. And that was a large main stem dam that had blocked the Kennebec right in Augusta. And by removing that single dam, it opened up more than 15 miles of the Kennebec, opened up really great migratory fish habitat. And so it was a big story. It was a national story. It was one of the largest dam removal projects, certainly on the East Coast at that time. And so that event was mobbed by the national media, and that was the era of conflict. And it's funny to think, this conflict has really died down, but of conflict over the Endangered Species Act listing for Atlantic salmon. This was a really, really hot issue in the late 90s. And, the opposition in Maine was fierce. Then Governor Angus King was especially opposed to listing the fish. Then Senator Olympia Snowe, very, very vehemently opposed. Then as today, the Penobscot had the nation's largest remaining run of Atlantic salmon. This is a large male from the federal hatchery in Orland. But as I've been reading more about the Penobscot River and its fish, I realized that salmon were really a smallish part of the populations that had originally, the migratory fish runs that had originally populated the river. The shad and river herring, alewives and bluebacks, were really a much bigger part of that. And this is an American shad. Is everyone familiar with shad? They're really cool fish. They're like 3 to 5 pounds. They're delicious. They take a fly. They're almost like a perfect fish.
From whose standpoint,
Mine. Anyway, but the Penobscot had so many shad historically. It had probably 2 million fish, maybe 10 million pounds of fish protein, and so by contrast, the historic salmon runs were maybe 60,000 fish. So shad had at one point far outnumbered the salmon, and but by 1999, nobody really knew how many shad were in the river, but there were very few. River herring, these are alewives and damarascata, but super abundant. They were far more abundant even than shad in the Penobscot historically. Again, by 1999, very few people knew how many there were. There were very few in the river. So when the national spotlight was on the Edwards Dam, I wrote about the Penobscot dams, trying to put its status into historical context. I became really intrigued by the fact that, you had this river that had once been likely Maine's most productive river, and was now, dammed, and people talked about Atlantic salmon, and the Atlantic salmon are a huge story. But there was this whole other story that I felt just really was getting short shrift. So the challenge of freeing the Penobscot, though, seemed just impossibly daunting. So here again is VZ, and this is another view of that fish ladder. Is the kind of wing on the left that's sticking out on the right, that's sticking out into the river. So above VZ, then you had the Great Works Dam, and so as opposed to taking out Edwards, where you could take out one dam and free up just a lot of great habitat, here you had 2 dams in the lower 50, really 3 dams in the lower 15 miles of the river. These 2, and then right above them, Milford, and really pretty atrocious fish passage, and so a really surprising, tough situation, I would say, rather not surprising, but tough situation for restoration. But here's the surprising thing. In 2003, people announced a project to take down those 2 dams, and so this was a very exciting story. And I covered it for the Boston Globe, and it was an interesting story from I think the sort of the idea that it was even possible to do this. At that time, it was a $23 million project. I think the final price tag was $60 million. It involved a whole lot of agencies. Obviously, the Penobscot tribe was hugely involved. But one of the interesting things that happened when the Penobscot River Restoration Project kicked off with this idea that they were going to remove these dams, open up fish passage, and restore this really productive lower stretch of the river, is that researchers, including many from here at the University of Maine, started conducting baseline research to try to figure out what's in the river. What do we have any shad? Now, when I did that story for Maine Times, I had gone down and interviewed old timers at the shad club, or the salmon clubs rather, below the VZ Dam, and said, what do you think? Are there shad in the river? And one guy said, I've been fishing here 40 years and I've caught 2. So, it didn't seem like there were a lot. I interviewed another guy who said he used to fish for sturgeon in the river in the 1920s and 1930s, and he didn't know of any sturgeon in the river. So there were a lot of questions. What fish are still in the river? And at that time, it seemed like, well, probably not many. That fish passage out in the center was not well designed for anything but Atlantic salmon. It was pretty good for Atlantic salmon, but most other species wouldn't ascend that. So anyway, people started doing some research about what fish are in the river. In 2006 and 2007, Stephen Fernandez, who was a graduate student with Gail Zidleski, and Mike Kinnison, they found sturgeon in a lot of them. This is Philip Dion, isn't it, with you? Okay. I went out with Gail and did a story maybe in 2007. They were looking for sturgeon in the river, and they didn't just find sturgeon. They found piles of them, 155 in the first 2 years, 155 short-nosed sturgeon, 36 Atlantic sturgeon. You guys know how big Atlantic sturgeon are. I mean, like 200 pounds. They're massive fish. And they were in the Penobscot, and they leap, right? But no one knew they were there. So the story was starting to get pretty cool that, there were sturgeon in the river. It was a really unexpected finding, and that made it kind of a cool story that, this river did have sturgeon. Here they're radio tracking. This was like active radio transmitters, right? So that was a really cool story that there were sturgeon in the river. They'd been there unnoticed for a long time. Not long after that, Joe Zidleski and his students found that there were still shad in the river. And there were pretty many of them, and they were hanging out below the fish ladder, and they used sonar and imaging to find them. They were hanging out there, but they wouldn't go up. Like in 20 or 30 years, maybe a dozen shad had ascended the ladder. It wasn't that they weren't there. They didn't like that fish ladder. They were hanging out. They were spawning in the river. There was a remnant population. And so that was cool, too, to find out. And so even before the dams came out, there were some really interesting findings right here on the river. And again, these are the kinds of things that make you look at the river a little bit differently. There's sturgeon in the river. There's shad. It's not just salmon. It's pretty cool. So the dams started to come down about 4 or 5 years ago, and I covered that for the New York Times too. And this story too has superlatives. It has the nation's biggest run of Atlantic salmon. Arguably Maine's most productive river. Certainly the most ambitious dam removal project on the East Coast. And there were these mysteries. Were there shad in the river? How many? Were there sturgeon in the river? How many and where? What part of the river did they use? And so I decided to drop in on the story again this summer, and so why was this a good story to report now? And this is the story that David Hart referred to that just came out a couple of months ago. Well, the timing is good because the fish are starting to return. In a very short time, some of the river's mysteries were being solved. The questions were, would fish return to the unplugged stretch of the river, the new habitat? Would they ascend the new fish lift? In Milford, at the Milford Dam, there's a pretty remarkable new fish lift that just, it's not a fish ladder, but it's basically an elevator. They fill it up, lift it, and all the fish, alewives, shad, salmon, get dumped out and then proceed up the river. It's pretty dramatic. Would they swim through the bypass at Howland? So another element of this project is a bypass around a dam way upriver where the dam wasn't removed, but like an at-grade channel was dug that fish could swim up on their own power. And the answer here was yes, yes, and yes. Fish were coming back. They were in surprising numbers and surprisingly quickly. So the story also had a little bit of technology, which editors really love. It had the tracking of fish going on that Joe and his students were doing, and it had that less tangible element that I love. Understanding the large scale fish migrations really allows you to see the river, I think, and by extension, all of the large rivers of New England through a different lens. I mean, as fish superhighways, which is really what they used to be. I mean, the productivity of these rivers historically is really mind-boggling. To imagine what in sort of pre-settlement times these rivers look like in April, May, and June, I think is really hard to imagine. And it had a broader theme too, this story, which my editor had asked me to explore, and I was glad he did. which is that nationwide large-scale dam removals are gathering steam. So we talked a little bit in the story about the Elwha Dam, which came out on the Olympic Peninsula in Washington, and then the Klamath dams on the Klamath that are coming out also on the West Coast. So there were a lot of reasons. It was a lot of reasons combined to make it a pretty decent story to tell in 2016. I want to just kind of touch on a couple other things really quickly. Because I mentioned the messed up food chain, I feel like I have to talk about it a little bit. Here's Joe Zaleski and Kevin Jobs out on the river. Kevin Job. This is the fish lift at Milford. And this, before I move on from the Penobscot, these are striped bass going up through the dam at Milford. I mean, again, if you had told me 20 years ago you have striped bass, heading up towards Costigan, I would have said no. Well, here they are. So, the messed up food chain. This, when I worked at the Republican Journal, our editor had this on his door. A story needs a news hook, and then it gets stale, even though it's still a good story. And I think this is messed up because a lot of times, something might happen that's a huge news event, and then a lot of sort of stories that have merit might get pushed aside. As an example, when I worked for MPBN, I worked for a while out of the Augusta Bureau. And when the legislature was in session, pretty much 2 out of 4 of our stories every day would be from the State House. And that's not to say that, everything else is still going on elsewhere in Maine, right? There's news happening. But because the legislature was in session, that was going to take up a lot of space. And a more dramatic example is I interviewed Roxanne Quimby years ago, 2001, when she first wanted to donate her land to the federal government. And I remember when that story was mapped to run in the Christian Science Monitor on September 12, 2001. It got bumped, right? It's the day after September 11th. So, it ran, many weeks later. But my point is, a good story isn't always, I don't think it's necessarily meritocratic, that a good story isn't always going to be timely, and it may be not, a timely story may come out at a moment when other things are going to preempt it. So that's, I think, a little bit unfair, and I think it's a little bit messed up about our food chain. This kind of thing drives me nuts. This is a story that there was a mystery beast, glowing eyes, whatever, and it was eating pets in Turner. This is in 2006. Well, it's a silly story, right? It's a silly story, and they got hit by a car and no one knew what it was. It was like a chow mix dog. It's not a mystery beast, but there was enough coverage of it in the local papers and then in the Lewis and Sun Journal that AP, did a story, and MPBN did a story, and this is what I mentioned, what David mentioned in the intro, that sometimes a story gathers momentum, and even though it doesn't merit coverage, it will get coverage, and that's another thing that I think is messed up about the food chain. I think for science journalists, there's the other problem of overhyping stories. When I was doing my caffeine book, the news about coffee is a great example. If you read like Yahoo News, and one day it's like coffee will kill you, and the next day it's like coffee will make you live to be 200, and it's people love these stories, but they get overhyped. And this is Ivan Oransky, who's a good science journalist. He runs something called Retraction Watch, which is a pretty interesting site. He wrote this for Stat News, and this is the nut of it. Scientists dress up weak findings in flashy clothes, and then their universities often bolster this flimsy work with frothy press releases that journalists fall for. And this is really actually not something that I think the University of Maine does, like the PIOs here. But that is something that happens. You get a story, it's overhyped, and then sometimes it'll get national news. And a lot of people who are daily reporters aren't reading the papers. They're reading the press releases, and then they're calling their sources. And you can avoid a lot of this by reading the paper and saying, you know what, that's not what the press release says that they found out. And so science journalists should do that. I think the challenge here for journalists, and this is more from Ivan Oransky, is we should spend less energy trying to follow the bouncing ball of what the latest data show and devote more time to finding context for these findings. And I think this is another challenge of journalism is we do go for the latest and sort of sexiest stories, and often don't stick with it long enough to see what the significance of the story is. And a sort of tangential problem that I think with a lot of stories, and I'm at fault for this too, a lot of times we'll report a story once and then not drop in again 4 years later or 5 years later, or see, hey, they reclaimed that lake to make it habitable for native fishes. Are the fish coming back? And so I think that we really need to stick with stories. So these are some of the ways that I think the food chain is slightly messed up. I'm just going to mention a couple of other things here, and then I'd like to get some questions if I could. And this is one of the reasons that I think science journalism gets hyped. This is Eureka Alert, which is something that journalists get from AAAS, and we get, if you sign up for this, you get dozens of releases, news about dozens of new papers literally every single day. And so it can be hard to sort of sort the wheat from the chaff. And so if someone's really hyping a story, or a PIO is really hyping a story, it's going to get more attention. I want to mention briefly climate change, because it's the environmental/science story of our time, and it's the hardest to report on. This is just my wife vaporizing some coffee on a very cold day, which we're having fewer of, unfortunately. Climate change is so overwhelming, and I've written a couple of sort of global, this is climate change, or climate change in Maine stories, and it's really hard. They become what I call deadly issue stories. It's just, not only does it not really have a narrative, but it's also kind of depressing, and it's just really hard to bring a reader along. So I just want to mention a couple of stories that caught my attention very recently that were terrific. This was an Outside magazine by Christopher Solomon. This woman's a veterinary pathologist in Alaska, and she happens to see critters that are dying often from the effects of climate change. Very interesting character, very interesting story. It's the kind of story you read. It's a feature story. It's about climate change, but you can't put it down. So, that's a good story. It's a very character-driven story, but that has a really important heart about climate change. And this is another one, just from the past couple of weeks from the Atlantic. This is a guy, essentially a hermit who lives in Colorado, who has kept, sort of in a Thoreau-like way, track of the emergence of flowering plants and the arrival of bees and birds just since the 70s. And yet his data is proving to be very helpful because the climate is changing so rapidly at altitude in Colorado. So again, it's a story about him. He's a compelling character. It makes it an interesting story. It's not like a deadly, climate change story. I just wanted to mention those really briefly. I guess the last thing I want to mention is it's really important to get outside. Get outside with scientists. This is Chris Hoffman, and who was studying vernal pools, and those are little hatchling wood frogs. I think it lets a story breathe. You see unexpected things, you learn unexpected things. It's really, a so-called desk job story. It's not, I think, nearly as good. They're just inherently going to be better. These are some of the blue-spotted salamanders she was tracking. So getting outside, I think, is really important. And I think, should be near the end. Fishless Lake Story, another Maine researcher. Amanda Sheeran in the back. Again, getting outside is, I think, really helps to report these stories. Oh gosh, I'm just going through a bunch of old stories. This is Mike Kinnison caught in the act. Here, I do want to hit this real quickly. this is a story I did that I mentioned. Steve Call had written a report about the water quality impacts of clear cutting. And clear cutting too, it's funny, this was a really huge issue in Maine 20 years ago. We don't talk about it that much anymore. This is long, after the spruce budworm epidemic. But he was talking about how the clear cutting can change nutrient cycling and can actually have chemical impacts, so that you can get aluminum released from the soil. And so the little streams that are flowing off clear cuts can have significantly different water chemistry than streams that are in mature forest. So interesting story, but then this is another story with the Maine connection. This is Aaron Simons, who was working with William Crone, and they looked at, it turned out that a lot of the lynx numbers, we had high lynx numbers about 8 years ago, and still do, relatively high, and a lot of that is due to the massive clear cuts that we did with the spruce budworm epidemic in the late 80s. And the reason I wanted to mention these two stories is because I think a lot of people think of environmental journalists as, so-called environmentalists, and they want us to be on one side or the other of an issue. And I think that's highly inappropriate. I think we should report, what scientists are finding, and sometimes it might say, yeah, well, there's unexpected benefits from clear cuts. Sometimes it might say, well, the water chemistry is lousy. And I know some of my sources wish that I would cover things a different way, but that's just, that's how we do it. That's all I have. I'd love to hear story ideas, news tips. That's my email address, and I'd love to take any questions. Yeah.
Wondering what you said about how scientists oftentimes kind of maybe exaggerate the results a little bit and their applicability. I'm wondering how often you find that to be the case. I guess I assumed, I don't know much about it, but I assumed that a lot of times with journalists who take what some of the scientist says and make it pretty for the public. Is it mostly what you found is mostly scientists?
No, I would say the latter is much more common, that a journalist would take a paper and sort of expand the implications, right? Suggest that it has broader implication than it really does. Sometimes, though, I think scientists do, and not the best scientists, sort of push their findings a little bit. And the way I often find this is if you start looking at papers, and again, all this stuff takes time, but you look at footnotes, and they'll say 10% of whatever had lesions. You look at the footnote, and it didn't say 10%. And I think people are sort of, I don't know, sometimes people are sloppy. And I have great respect for scientists and researchers and what they do. I just think as a journalist you have to be careful, and you have to not assume that everything that you're reading is perfect. But no, to be clear, I think if a paper's getting hyped, it's typically going to be on the end of the public information officer and then the journalist, and not the scientist. Does that answer your question? Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
I really like your point about sort of making sure that scientists don't encourage you to present any one perspective, like keeping you on the environmental side. I wonder how you balance that, especially when you sort of think it has to have a hook, it has to be the best or the biggest or the smallest or whatever. I think one of the struggles in science is it's all about balance. Of course, clear cutting are going to benefit one thing and not another. I mean, how do you turn that into sexy? It feels like that's probably one of those challenging things. It's all about a balance, and when one thing is out of balance, then potentially it's going to affect something else. I mean, by definition, there's always multiple sides to the story. So I wonder how you deal with that. You have to have a hook.
Yeah. So I mean, this is the constant challenge, right? And further, I think what you're saying is exactly right. The best stories are the ones, not where you got like a guy in a black hat and a guy in a white hat, and you can sort of squeeze them into a template that we all know, like a Western, right? But they're the shades of gray stories. And they're the hardest ones to tell, and they're the hardest ones to sell. And, I guess for me, having done this for quite some time, I've worked with editors for a long time, and they know me and they trust me. And so if I'll pitch a story to someone who I hope will get it, but it is a constant challenge. I don't know if there's an easy answer to that. Anything else?
Speaking of pitching to editors, aside from the timing of the story, how do you decide which outlets to pitch in the context of the story?
Yeah.
National outlets, more localized outlets. What guides that decision?
Well, part of it will be one sort of divider is it a radio story or is it a print story? And a radio story, I didn't talk really about radio at all, but I love doing radio, and one of the things that'll make a radio story good is sound. So if a story has natural sound and an obvious scene where I could go and get people in, then it might be a good radio story. Conversely, there's some people who are great sources, who are really smart, who are super articulate, who are horrible on the radio. No, seriously. They're very few, but there's some. And so that would not be a radio story. So that's one divide, and then the other is, really is it a story with that, that's now national, and then I sort of go through a tree. If it's not a national story, then who would want it? Would it be a radio story or otherwise? I mean, there's only really about a half dozen people that I really write or report for right now. So it's usually. However, there's stories. I've pitched stories. More than a dozen times, certainly. And just had flat out rejections before I got someone who wanted it. And sometimes it's because the timing was right later. Sometimes it's just because it just didn't land at the feet of the right editor. So. Does that answer your question at all? Yeah.
Your stories look really interesting. If we wanted to be able to read them and learn from them, how do we find all these?
Well, I've got this big old box in my office, and I throw them all in there.
If we Google,
you should be able to mostly, yeah. And I have a few up on my website, which is murraycarpenter.com. Unfortunately, like a lot of the stuff that I did for Maine Times, the archive is just, for MPBN, the archive is gone. So, but yeah, they're out there. And they're not as interested as I'm making them sound anyway. Anything else? Yeah, Dave.
So you made a remark about fake news, or at least you quoted somebody
Yeah.
about that. And I think what I was first going to ask is, where do stories like this make a difference? How do they make a difference? And is the way they can potentially make a difference changing in the current world?
So to answer the second part of the question first, is it changing? Yes, I think it's changing very dramatically, and so one of the things, obviously, with social, we live in a wonderful world as media consumers right now, because we can, with a click of a button, pull up just about any story we want. So really, that's the glass half full side. The glass half empty side is you can pull up any story anytime, and it might not be a good story. It might actually be either lousy news or outright fake news. And so that is a challenge, and I think as we've moved from either TV or daily papers that were sort of this curated collection of news that most of us consumed into social media, we have new challenges. I do think news consumers are somewhat savvy and understand, say if this appears on the Bangor Daily News website, this is news, or if it appears on their opinion page, I'll read that. The phenomenon of fake news, I'm hoping it's somewhat, limited. And so I think what news consumers can do and how these stories can make a difference is if they appear in legitimate media outlets that people do respect and trust. And certainly I would include those that I work for. Then I think, they can advance the conversation. I don't know. It is a very challenging time for many reasons. Even before the challenges of the new administration, which for the media I think are many.
So what advice do you have for the scientists in the room in terms of making sure their story doesn't turn into fake news or be on the wrong side of the coin? How do you identify someone who is a reputable person to tell your story?
Yeah, and that's a great question. I run into this all the time because, not all the time, but every once in a while, I'll talk to a source and they'll say, well, you know, the last guy I talked to. And all I can say is, I'm not the last guy you talked to. You know?
Well, I trust you.
Yeah, well, thank you. But yeah, I think that you have to, like, if someone's a source that you know, or a reporter that you know, and they're with an outlet that you trust, that's it. And beyond that, I think you really have to be careful. And I think this is a two-way street. Like, if I'm talking to a source and they're like, look, I really need you to understand, and they're overly emphatic about what they want me to report about the story, that can be hard. On the other hand, if there's something that's easy to misinterpret, it is probably your job as a scientist to be clear. You know, the implications of this story are limited to X, Y, and Z, and you know, I don't think it means that whatever. So, I think that's a little bit of a wishy-washy answer, but it's a challenge, and I think we've all been on the bad side of this one, probably. You know. Yeah, Captain.
I wonder, in looking back over your stories, preparing for this talk, if you saw any trends, whether in yourself personally or in what editors wanted in terms of science stories. So there's like three, the timing of it, right? When people get the grant, oh, this big grant, we're going to save the world, right? Or the in the middle of the research, so you're out in the field and it's happening, and here's the question and the mystery. Or when the paper comes out and here's the big finding, we're going to change the world. Like, do you see any trends in what editors want or what you have preferred?
Well, so I'd say one thing that has changed, and it goes back to the Eureka Alert thing, is there are more daily science journalists whose job it is to turn around basically the press release of the day, and they're often very good. And the Washington Post has them, and the Boston Globe has them, and the New York Times has them. And you can look at the embargoed press releases from the day before and know what the top two stories are going to be the next day. So there's almost like this science writing machine that I think is a little bit more, I don't know if it's comprehensive, but
Journalism.
yeah, journalism. But I don't necessarily mean that in a bad way. It's high speed science writing. So you know, I think that's going on. Since I'm not on staff anywhere, I can be, you know, somewhat aside from that right now, and so I couldn't really say how things have changed. I do know that, you know, when you're on staff somewhere and you're expected to turn something out tomorrow, you know, you better find a good story. But I'm not sure that anything much has changed. I think the sophistication maybe of the production of science news has increased over the years. Anything else? Yeah.
Kind of touching back on your comment regarding like trustworthy news. A big portion of the any of the courses that I teach is an assignment on information literacy and trying to get students to understand and comprehend that everything they read is not truth, and that they might actually have to go beyond the first 3 links that come up in Google to figure out what's actually happening. And I guess I will get to my question. But I guess I'm thinking about major news sources, and yes, I might trust BDN, I might trust the New York Times, but we do interact with colleagues and you know, everyday people, but also our students who think, you know, for example, the way Fox News spins that climate change news stories, that is the truth. And I guess if you might have any words of wisdom on maybe how to steer our students, maybe not as politically in terms of like batting like MSNBC versus Fox News, but a way of maybe more gently guiding them to actually become more information literate and knowing where to actually look for information versus, you know, maybe more leaning news sources.
I wish I did. In terms of your preamble there, I mean that's the nut of this challenge right now, and we have access to this. This younger generation has access to news in a way that people of my generation never did, you know, and so it's really a very different media climate, and so I think it is very important that people be educated. How best to do that, I don't know, because it is all imbued with what your attitudes are. I mean, some people think that NPR is a communist organization, so and some people conversely think Fox News is the devil incarnate. So it's really a challenge. I don't know how best to do that, except I think your suggestion of gently guiding people in the right way. I would say something that's really important, and especially with the speed of how things change, and this is one of the things that journalists are always, I think, known for and should be, is you really have to be skeptical. If in terms of fake news, did some guy really find 100 boxes of ballots pre-made for Hillary Clinton? It's like, if it sounds too good to be true, or sounds too dramatic to be true, maybe it is. So skepticism, critical thinking, it's a challenge. It really is. I don't know what the answer is, but it's a challenge, and it's a new challenge, and it's a challenge that this generation, particularly people who are in college now and a little bit older, are having to face. Yeah.
Along those lines, I'm really interested. I read a book about how our attention span is just decreasing so much with the internet. Do you feel like your articles have had to be shorter? And one of the things I struggle with is, like, how do you find out the truth? How does anybody find out the truth about anything if they're not willing to read more than like a paragraph? I mean, these things are not simple. So I'd love to know what students face today as far as their attention span and how long of an article they're really reading.
Well, I don't know about students. I think people still have a strong appetite for longer feature stories and long-form journalism. And I think one of the really interesting trends recently is the great narrative nonfiction you're finding on podcasts. In terms of attention span, people are by the thousands, by the hundreds of thousands, sitting down and listening for an hour at a time to really compelling podcasts. And I think the barriers to entry are lower. It's easier to get equipment. There's a lot more people who are trained in the art of storytelling. It's fascinating. And so I don't think it's all dire, but there is something related to what you're saying. Is I think you have to be careful with headlines and sort of your nut graph to make sure that if that's all people are reading, that they know what the story is about. Because in many cases that is all people are reading.
Anything else? Well, let's thank Ray again.